So we'll continue this morning with a glance into the unseen part of our liturgical life. We are material, and therefore we tend to think in the terms which are familiar to us, but there's far more going on than meets the eye. If we look at the vision given to the prophet Isaiah, we observe that he immediately was made aware of a different kind of presence. So we have here in the 6th chapter the description of the presence that fills the house. I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Now the word saraf in Hebrew means to burn, so the seraphim are the burning ones. Each had 6 wings, with 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. In the Hebrew that's Shabaot. The Oth is the plural of a host, an army. The whole earth is full of his glory. The word glory in Hebrew is the same word as weight. Something is weighty. It carries heaviness. It carries power. It carries otherness. Glory. Chavod. And the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called. And the house was filled with smoke. So here we have a few things coming through. There is a voice heard, presumably some kind of melodic voice. We have this sense also of odour coming in, perfume, smoke. There is a mystery. And we find this smoke also in other theophanies. We found that Moses had an experience of smoke and glory and otherness there where he went to receive the law. The mountain was trembling and there was smoke all around. Also we have the occasion of the house of God being consecrated and the priests are covered in smoke. Smoke, the Shekinah, which comes from the root of to dwell. The Hebrew words usually have 3 consonants. Here we have Shekinah. Well, that gives us the root of the dwelling place, the presence, the abidingness. So here, Shekinah is the actual, as it were, palpable presence of God. It comes also in the Exodus, guiding the people. Smoke in the day and a column of fire by night. Shekinah. So this smoke that we also, in common with our Eastern brethren, and indeed in common with pre-Christian worship in the temple, we express with the use of holy perfume, incense, which does suggest otherness. It affects even the emotions, and when accompanied with good gestuality, it leads to a notion of otherness. We're in a different atmosphere. And when one comes into a church where there is lingering incense, if the church also is architecturally inspiring, one does become automatically aware that one is coming into something similar to what Moses came into when he was told to take off his sandals, for the ground on which he was treading was holy ground. We are coming into God's domain. So, the reaction of Isaiah is, Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Whether he's actually seen the essence is questionable. He has seen what can be seen, the traces thereof. He has had an encounter as far as possible on this side The beatific vision is reserved for the next, but we have in some way some traces of it, and it's also accessible to souls in a state of grace who are genuinely in love with Jesus, because quietly he does have ways of manifesting himself to the soul, as indeed in the farewell discourse in the Gospel of St. John he does make that promise, that we will manifest ourselves to him. That element of being somehow talked to by God is also our experience, for the Lord knows what we will perceive, and that is what he will use for us personally. There is a genuine encounter in praise, and liturgy is a privileged moment of encounter. If we are not encountering the divine, but only the human, then liturgy is not having its effect. It has become too horizontal. Liturgy has to be the place where God is able to be faced without distraction. If the liturgy itself becomes the centre of attention, that is also another distraction. So it has to be quiet and, in a sense, automatic, so that we can glide and not be aware of it. We disappear in a cloud and gaze. Now, these mysterious presences appear in other places in Scripture, and they have something in common. We find them in Ezekiel. Already in the first chapter we have that strange vision that he had by the river Kebar, and we have these four-winged creatures. The cherubim is something that we find in other ancient cultures, because it is actually either of Assyrian origin. The root could be that of might in Assyrian, or it could be Akkadian or Babylonian, in which case it would be the root for propitious, glorious. And so we have pre-Christian roots coming here for the mysterious. Cherubim, again we have the plural in the Hebrew, im, coming in there, the masculine plural. Oth, as in Sabaoth, is the female plural. There we have these beings who are also perceived here and there in Scripture, coming and going and protecting. Already in the Pentateuch they are there, and Moses is given that instruction from on high to create this reminder that the dwelling place of God is protected. It's rather unexpected, actually, that we should find these creatures there because of the Decalogue itself, which prohibits things which are too plastic. But they are there, encouraging man to remember that there is an awesomeness about the presence of God. And so we have this protective angelic presence over the propitiatorium, that place where God was especially honoured, the Holy of Holies, the place where atonement is made. We find something similar at the end of the Bible, in the Apocalypse. And we do well when on a weekday we sometimes take parts of the Apocalypse in the third canticle of Vespers to place our eyes there on this beyond, remembering that our liturgy here on earth is the counterpart of that heavenly liturgy which is going on ceaselessly until the end of time. God is honoured. And we must remember too that the angelic presence is more ancient than the human one, for the first wave of creation was that of the angels. We came on in a second wave of creation, but the angels are there for many, many, many aeons, honouring gratuitously. And indeed it is thought that the higher ranks of angels do nothing but honour and glory God, whereas the guardians who are closest to us have all kinds of material things to do as well. I'd like to look for a few minutes at some of these issues with regard to the angelic presence that protects. By chance, I have found something which, in pictorial form, might help those who are listening. It is very recent, it is very modern, and it has all the marks of authenticity. But sometimes man more easily remembers and grasps truths through a story or an image than through an abstract page. And so it wouldn't do any harm to intersperse this lecture with something visual. So I just read parts of this report which came to me out of the blue recently, and which, as I say, probably is authentic. It happened on October the 2nd, notice the date, October the 2nd of last year, 2014. I'll just read quietly some extracts from this. It's a little girl whose name is Isabel, and she says this in all simplicity. I had a vision. I was at Mass in school, and I was kneeling because it was about 30 seconds before the consecration. I heard a quiet and soft, dreamy, twinkling sound next to my ear. So I looked next to me, and one of the most beautiful creatures I have ever seen was there, an angel. But I was not afraid. I looked at his face, and he smiled the most beautiful smile at me. I looked around, and I saw an angel kneeling next to every person in my school. So they just had to be guardian angels. Then I looked at the priest, and the one next to him was dressed differently. He had a silver chest plate and a red skirt with slits in it, and sandals and shoulder plates, and a sword on his right side, and big grey wings which were extended. Later I found out that it was St. Michael the Archangel. Father Nicholas said, St. Michael stands at the right side of the priest at every consecration. The other angels had big white wings that were hovering behind the backs of their person, the ones they were guarding, that is. Some of the angels had togas, and some had a white gown with flowing sleeves, and they all had ropes tied in a certain way, and all had sandals on their feet. They had either blonde or very light brown curly hair, and light blue eyes. Father Walter's angel was behind him, between Father and St. Michael. Then, about 10 baby angels came down through the roof. Their eyes were looking up towards heaven as they came down and surrounded the altar. Then the priest, Father Walter, raised the host, and all the angels left their person, that is, the guardians left the person that they were guarding, and zoomed to the altar. They zoomed through the air as if they were flying, but their wings were tucked behind them. Some were kneeling and some were floating, and they all had wide, beautiful, amazed eyes as they focused on the consecration. They stayed at the altar for the entire consecration. After the consecration was over, the baby angels went through the roof, and the guardian angels came back to their person and all sang, Hallelujah, sing to Jesus. But St. Michael did not sing. Then I looked at my angel, and he looked at me, and smiled and waved, and then all the angels started to vanish one by one. It was a wonderful gift to have this heavenly vision, and the Lord has truly blessed me by permitting me to have this beautiful encounter." Now that's the report of this little child who has no reason to fabricate it. But then we have more information because her mother, Karen, interrogates her, and we have more detail coming through the answers given to the mother. On October the 2nd, 2014, the Feast of the Guardian Angels, my 9-year-old daughter Isabel was at morning mass at her school, Donahue Catholic School, Ave Maria, Florida, when just prior to the consecration she heard a sound which she described as someone running their fingers across the strings of a harp, and the sound of wind blowing through trees. The sound was very faint and distant, but audible enough that it caused her to turn her head to her left in the direction it came from, and when she did so, she saw an angel kneeling next to her. She then looked around and noticed an angel on the left side of every single person in the church, all the teachers, all the students, all the parents, the priest on the altar, and all the altar servers. Except Mrs. Smith. She had 2 angels next to her. It turned out that Gretel Smith was holding her son George in her arms, and so she had 2 angels next to her. At the moment of the elevation of the Holy Eucharist, all of the angels zoomed to the altar and with big eyes witnessed the transubstantiation. When pressed about big eyes, Isabel rephrased and said worshipping eyes. There were also 10 baby angels. Now, these are cherubim, because remember that we portray these quite often as little chubby angels, don't we? They're all around. Cherubim, who remained floating above the air the entire time. Notice their function then is gratuitous praise and worship. Isabel described the baby angels as so cute and chubby. Immediately after the consecration was over, the baby angels ascended into the ceiling and disappeared, while all the other angels went back. So these must be the guardian angels. They went back to the persons that they were guarding and began to sing Hallelujah. Now at this point the little child began to sing what she had heard, and she heard this: Hallelujah, sing to Jesus, is the scepter, is the throne. And we're told that the child said the angels sang 2 verses of the song in the most beautiful harmony she had ever heard. Rather interesting that they sang Havradol, that's an old Welsh hymn tune, and in Wales they automatically go into 4-part harmony. I'm sure the angels went into far more than 4 parts of harmony. After the singing, Isabel's angel looked at her, and she looked at him. Then he smiled and waved at her, and then all the angels vanished one by one until they were all gone. When pressed about referring to the angels as him, she said, all the angels are boys. She described how the angels looked, what they were wearing, what their hair was like, what colour their eyes were, how beautifully they sang, and the baby angels ascending into the ceiling, with one knee bent upward, arms extended and raised, palms turned inward, and eyes looking up. She repeatedly described how pretty the angels were, and when pressed to explain, she said, because the light round them was so bright, and because their complexion was so perfect, and their skin so pure. She specifically said they had no big noses, or freckles, or pimples. She described their hair, all curly, mostly blonde, some light brownish. The length of their hair, varying lengths, mostly short, some longer, nothing below the shoulders. The colour of the eyes, light blue. The way they were dressed, all dressed in one of two styles, either a long white flowing gown with wide flowing sleeves, or dressed Greek. When pressed about Greek, she responded, a white dress across the chest like a toga. And all the angels had ropes around their waist, with the long part hanging down. She described the halos on their head as dim yellow light rings hovering over the crown of their heads, and their wings large and white, which they all have, but they don't need them because they can go anywhere they want without wings. Isabel described the movement of the angels' wings when they were at the altar. Their wings move up and down like this. She then demonstrated by stretching her arms wide and very gently and gracefully moving them up and down. She further explained that when the angels were kneeling, their wings were extended, and their right wing was protectively behind the back of their person. So that's what our guardian is doing. He's really shielding us. Isabel said the angels are all very tall, and when asked how tall, she looked round the room and pointed to the grandfather clock, which is at least 8 feet tall, and said, "That tall." St. Michael the Archangel was on the altar to the right of the priest, facing towards the altar, but you could see his face. He wore a red shirt, he had a chest plate and shoulder guards, and a long sword and sandals. He had light brown, curly, shoulder-length hair. His wings were very large and grey in colour. St. Michael, whom Isabel described as big and strong, stood motionless the entire time with his arms down at his side and his hands formed into loose fists. Isabel said, St. Michael did not participate in the singing with the other angels after the consecration. She did not see him move his mouth or his body at all. Then we have this interesting detail. Our pastor, Father Corey Meyer, said that St. Michael has not spoken, nor could he speak again after the words he spoke immediately prior to fighting Lucifer and his angels in heaven. Well, be that as it may, we do know that what he said is important, and it applies to liturgy. Who is like God? Michael, quis ut Deus? And for man to want to be the centre of attention anyway in the liturgical sphere is to play the game precisely of Lucifer. And if we're not careful, we can find ourselves using church slots to be visible and to glorify ourselves, subtly, but really, it's a part of that game. We have here the real vision of things, angelic and sublime, heavenly and not earthly, of a different order, gratuitous and prolonged, no hurry, all gliding calmly. That's the ethos that we have, and that is what liturgy is about. So I'll come back to that in a few minutes' time now. Good, so we return to the celestial sphere. There's a little detail here which is of note in the story I told. The little girl, Isabel, shared this encounter with her mammy, Karen, on October the 12th, 10 days after it had happened. And upon further investigation, we discovered that it happened on Thursday, October the 2nd, the Feast of the Guardian Angels. When asked why she thought this happened to her, she said, "I don't know, Mummy. I always think about my guardian angel." So we have something here which is of note. This little girl is a bit special. She has a great devotion to her guardian angel. Now listen to this bit. I always talk to and pray to my guardian angel. And I always tell Vicky, her classmate, that she sits next to daily at Mass, to move over, to leave room for my guardian angel. So here we have heaven very close to little children. And is it not true that if we listen carefully to children, often we see more through their innocent eyes? Children are often the eyes of the adults when it comes to celestial realities. Is it not true that it is to children that Our Lady showed the depths of hell at Fatima? Are we not too intellectual and wise to know too much to have anything to learn? Have we not cancelled those realities from our field of vision? Children receive and don't question. So we need to have that vision of children, not too quick to argue away what they say. I've had quite a few experiences with children who have actually genuinely heard, seen or touched more than we know, because children are very close to the angelic sphere. The child is the angel of the earth, and until contaminated, needs great protection and respect. So, I return now to this question of what happened. We noticed that the guardian angels at the moment of consecration were zooming into the center of attention. That must be happening to us. Every time that we're there at the moment of consecration, our guardian angel is in some way moving towards Jesus in our name. He can get closer than we can. We notice too the powerful protection around the priest himself. Indeed, when one celebrates quietly on one's own with only angels present, one does sense something of that angelic presence around. One is never alone celebrating the sacred mysteries. And indeed, on one's own, it's almost more densely populated, because one sees and feels with the eyes of faith more than one does when one has to think about people to please. If liturgy is truly liturgy, that ought to be the experience of every celebration, that people are not the centre of attention at all, but only the Lamb on his throne, the only one to please. Now, I want to come back to this question here of the moment at which there was a crescendo of praise, worship and attention. It was the consecration. We have discussed in previous lectures the way in which the East looks at the consecration. For them, God is so huge that he cannot be pinned down, and so they already, out of an insurance policy, express worship when the gifts are brought in at the grand entry, that is, before the consecration. They don't quite know when God is actually taking possession of those gifts, and so the whole is surrounded with mystery. All they know for certain is that by the threefold Amen at the end of the anaphora, it is truly fully there. But in the West, we have this awareness that there is actually a point at which there is not the fullness there yet, but then there is. And indeed, should the priest have a heart attack or a stroke or anything which impedes him to terminate the celebration after the consecration, it must be another priest that carries on that celebration and brings it to conclusion. However, I want to pinpoint this moment of consecration itself. It has been picked up by mystics in the West. St. Teresa of Avila was shown at the moment of the elevation of the host, the presence of Jesus there, bright as the sun, but she was also allowed to see the state of soul of the priest who had just consecrated it, because he was throttled by two black demons, and it would seem that he was not in a state of grace, but the Lord wanted her to see the power of the words of consecration, which were not just his own. The Lord was borrowing his voice box, and it was his power coming through. Now, this element of a density of angelic presence at the consecration has also been picked up fairly recently in a very unexpected domain. It happened some years ago in Sicily. There was a very holy priest, a Franciscan, Padre Matthew Lagrua, who was a well-known exorcist and a man of great gifts, recognized with authentic charismatic gifts and a very large following, but no ego trip. He was man of God alone, and he was celebrating in a fairly large group in Sicily. It was a celebration which was actually fairly charismatic in style, but very reverent. And he had an awareness that there was going to be something special at that celebration. He was given that inkling already before he celebrated. And because they were recording the celebration, just by chance, it was picked up. It's at the moment precisely of consecration. What happens is this. One can hear on the tape the sound of the words of consecration, and it's as he's coming into the consecration actually of the chalice that there starts to be another swelling sound coming in. There is a quiet music ministry, and it stops because they can hear this other sound coming out of nowhere, and they let it happen. The Father carries on the words of consecration with great intensity, and very audibly, to the extent that the tape has to be lowered when playing it back because it becomes so audible and so loud, that this angelic harmony with instruments unknown comes out of nowhere and praises the Lamb on his throne, there before them all. They're all, as one of the ladies says, a bocca aperta, with open mouth, that is completely dumbfounded. They can hear it all. All, tutti hanno sentito, they all heard it. At the end, they decided to send the tape to Palermo University, to the experts in all things to do with sound and music and human voice. And the experts calmly and ponderately sent back a written report to the effect that this sound is associated with no known instrument. In other words, they just could not find an explanation for this unknown combination of sounds. It was not of the order of things known at all. Now, we'll have a tiny pause there for that message to sink in, and then when we come back, I'll try and find it on the YouTube which I have here before me to make it audible even now. So we'll come back in a few seconds' time, and I'll put it on by the instrument here to let it go through the air, because it's actually very, very clear. We'll come back now in a few minutes. So we return to the domain of the beyond, which is closer to us than we can possibly imagine. And it would be well to retain this next bit mentally for all our eventual liturgical encounters that involve the real presence and the moment of its crashing into our time, the consecration itself. Because all bodily posture, all mental attraction, all mental awareness should be linked with actually the reality that is around us. It is there, but the eyes of faith alone perceive it. However, the graces are there hovering in the air, and many of them we probably miss because we're not attentive to what we're doing and what is before us. We tend to think of what we see and make complete abstraction of what our eyes cannot perceive. So these graces are given to us that we might have the vision of faith and an awareness of what we cannot with the eyes perceive or with the ears hear. It is a different domain, but the souls involved in the mystical sphere are very much aware that this is the reality and that we only have a small part visible to our eyes. So here we are. I'll just play it now and listen carefully to this recording made in Sicily during the celebration of Holy Mass. And these Italians are commenting as they play it back. They were present and they're just dumbfounded again at seeing how they've got to put down the volume because it's so loud. And they say, an orchestra, it is an orchestra. Now, here we are. It's coming up now, and you can see this on YouTube if you go into my own website, and you'll find the Coping with the Fastest Priest in the West. It's a documentation showing what's actually happening.
Perché è fortissimo. Durante questa manifestazione avvenivano le guarigioni, le liberazioni, le consolazioni. Chi suonava la chitarra non ha suonato più, perché tutti erano ad occhi aperti, a bocca aperta, e quindi tutti lo sentivano, tutti l'hanno sentito.
So there we are, and it's there for the taking. I would suggest that as a personal practice, one took this attitude of never coming just in time for the beginning of Mass. A great blessing, in addition, is given to the soul well disposed and making that extra effort to prepare the terrain. In ancient spirituality, which pertains specifically to the liturgical domain, one talks about the remote preparation, which would be a perpetual state of serenity and grace. So there's always one linear moment and not one compartment for God and one for others, other things. And the other is the immediate preparation. Well, actually, the immediate preparation is the one at the very last moment before one celebrates, and that ought always to be sacred. But there is also the one in between, and that's the one that's often forgotten. It's the proximate celebration, which is when one is already coming out of the usual serenity of being in a state of grace and dialogue with Jesus, which is the natural preparation for a further encounter, the state of soul, by trimming and pruning what has to be done just before one comes into liturgical encounter. That's the bit that often is just not there. In the monastic life, it's there by the bell calling way before. But in any encounter with God, if God is God, he has to have the same respect. And therefore, this element of not cramming everything that must be done, just before the liturgy is something to be perceived for what it is. It's a trick which works. It traps graces. And if it's not happening, we're losing those graces. So there's also the awareness that the best possible time for encounter is the peaceful time. So the hour of day matters too. Remember all the saints who have encountered God at the crack of dawn. The sun rising meant the host rising, and the Mass at the beginning of the day was for 20 centuries the norm. It does help a lot when one is coming out of a quiet time of prayer. A sleep in the air around us, which is not therefore full of noise yet or distraction from the world's worries. The day has not yet happened. Coming there into a natural emptiness, fasting and awaiting, has a favouring moment already inbuilt. If we're coming into liturgy at other hours, then we have to make a double effort, that we make that proximate preparation by calming down before and getting there in time to switch off from what we're carrying with us. We have several liturgical encounters quite often in the day, depending on our state of life, but each one concerns the divinity. The saints and mystics were very much aware of what they were doing, and it would have been unthinkable for them to have, for instance, a mobile phone at their side half open when they were in prayer. St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who had so many responsibilities, would go into the monastic church and take the holy water and say to his worries, "Stay here, I'll take you up when I come out." And he would leave them at the holy water font when he came into church. So too, it's God's domain, and those graces, if they find us thinking about what we've left behind, will not touch us, because our brain is not available. So a calming down is important. Indeed, if we're coming into the quiet celebration of liturgy on our own, I mean the divine office, many of us do it, well, even there, even though now there's no longer any obligation to say the Pater Ave that used to be there before, way before the changes, still the ethos there should be in the air, that one comes, kneels and comes into the presence of God before going into the actual words of the office, if we are genuinely encountering the All-Holy and not just a bit of ourselves, getting through something and getting to the important thing as the next thing to be done afterwards. Many people go through the divine office trying to wonder what has to happen next and how to attack it, and they miss the point of the divine office. How many offices are spent in distraction? So, agge quod agis is the old saying, do what you are doing, that is, do well, do fully that thing which right now you are doing. And if that is done, then everything is done properly. If one thing is done during the other thing, then neither is done properly. So, it's time to wind up. I mentioned the question of the way in which the angels were singing. This is also something which concerns us, because in the explosion that came out of renewal after the Second Vatican Council, the rigid distinction between the Missa Cantata and the Missa Lecta, the sung Mass and the said Mass, was made more or less non-existent, and each celebration could be partly sung, so that there could be this celebratory mode in the air. And in many countries that is what one will find, France for instance. And it is not that difficult to put it up one notch in dignity by adding bits of music. So I would leave it there, remembering that this part too matters, that if we care for liturgy, we give it the best, and that means also the musical best, echoing our hidden friends around us who are dismayed when we sing badly, when we say quickly, when we say hurriedly and casually and distractedly, what they forever and ever do with utmost beauty and attention.